So first, I just wanted to ask you, what is your general I- idea around, number one, did you support the withdrawal? And number two, how do you think Biden handled it?
I support and supported the withdrawal. I think, you know, we were there too long to put it lightly. I think that the handling could have been better, but I also think that Trump would have screwed up the withdrawal. I think it became clear, you know, when Trump was interviewed on Newsmax, when he was actually asked, well, what would you have done differently? There wasn't really anything that he presented that he would have done differently. And I, am really disgusted with this corporate media concern. I almost call it concern trolling, where they've scrutinized the withdrawal after 20 years more than they ever scrutinized being there. And even like the drone strike, which, you know, this CENTCOM commander recently said, hey, you know what? We didn't get ISIS-K. We got 10 civilians, including maybe like 7 kids, I think it was, and we're sorry. Even the media seizing on that, it's like we were talking about that all the time under Obama, but it just wasn't really interesting to corporate media in the same way. So even that feels like another way to kind of say, we told you the withdrawal was a bad idea. Look at this drone strike that went wrong, even though there's hundreds, thousands of instances of similar drone strikes that did not garner that much of attention. So yeah, I'm glad that we are out to the extent that we're really out, right? And there's a question as to whether, you know, did contractors go back in, or are we fully out? I think that at a certain point, even though you break it, you buy it applies to some degree. At a certain point, when it becomes clear that just staying another year or 2 or 3 or 4 isn't actually going to fix anything, you have to say we are now getting out.
What I found interesting about what you're saying here is not only did they give more attention to withdrawal, but there was many norms that were broken under Trump when it came to Afghanistan and just general foreign policy, like behavior that did not get nearly as much coverage. For example, if we're so concerned about drone strikes, which obviously the drone strike is horrific, the fact that civilians died, I've covered it on my channel. It deserves to be covered. But where was this attention to detail when Trump escalated drone strike use by massive numbers in Afghanistan?
Yeah.
Not only did he do that, but he followed it up by restricting access to information about said drone strikes. So he escalates drone strikes, drops the mother of all bombs on Afghanistan, the Moab, and then restricts access to the data about what he's now doing in Afghanistan and across the Middle East.
Right. Yeah, I think that's part of why there's the political and then there's the media coverage. The media coverage seems so cynical, so cynical.
I 100% believe it, which is frustrating for me as somebody who specializes in specifically foreign policy, because what I'm watching happen in Afghanistan right now is absolutely horrific. Right, women have now basically been told they're not going to be able to get secondary education, like middle school and high school. But what we would think of that in America is not going to be available to women and girls. Boys have gone back to school, women have not. That's the same thing that they did with work in the 90s, that they just said, hey, don't go to work right now. And it wasn't until America invaded that that policy, of course, was reversed. We have seen the TikTok comedians get executed. We have seen all these horrific things happen, and I'm covering them, and it's important to cover these things. But what sucks is I feel like, number one, these things are now getting more attention because we're not there, and it's easy to basically like say, well, see, this is all the fault of the withdrawal. And number two, it's aggravating because I feel like I'm sitting there and I'm talking about all these human rights abuses, and everybody and the people walk into the room and they're like, "Oh yeah, I agree with you," and then I'll move on to say Saudi Arabia, or I'll move on to say, "Well, let's talk about women's rights in the United States. Let's talk about Texas," and then the room just everybody exits. Like, never mind. Okay, I'm gone.
Yeah.
We don't want to hold those standards universally.
The other thing this reminds me of that's also just kind of an absurdity of the way that these things are talked about is I don't know any. I don't want to like gatekeep with the term real progressive or real leftist, but I think the point I'm trying to make is I don't know any serious critics of our involvement in Afghanistan who think the Taliban is great or trustworthy or whatever. And there's been this sort of like black white reaction where if you say you like the withdrawal in that you think it's the right thing, all of a sudden there's, oh, you want to be negotiating with the Taliban and you're these are the people. And then they pull out the pictures like, no, the Taliban's horrible. And the Taliban was horrible when Trump was negotiating with them. And the Taliban's been horrible for a long time. But that's a different question then. What are we staying for? What will be achieved by staying? And is it the right decision? They're related questions, but they're separate issues.
Yeah, I find it hard to believe that also the standard is held universally, because there's been many times in American history that these same individuals who are crying foul right now have negotiated with powers as bad or pretty bad in comparison with the Taliban or just generally. For example, Stalin was an absolute monster. He was one of the worst human beings to ever exist on the planet. But we negotiated with him in World War II because we saw a bigger enemy, right?
Sure.
We have negotiated with Saudi Arabia, which has a terrible human rights record. We've negotiated with right-wing death squads in Latin America for our own benefit, even though we 100% shouldn't have even been there in the first place, right? And so it's weird for me to see this crying foul on the idea of any compromise whatsoever after they failed on a certain strategy for 20 years. Now, let's say that it was year 1 or 2, maybe you can have an argument like, okay, it's the first 2 years against the fight against the Taliban. Maybe you're right. Maybe we should just, but it's been 20 years of failed strategy. Now you can maybe, unless you want to tell me, okay, let's go another 20 years, then you have to at least give credence to the idea of looking at other strategies and how to deal with the situation.
Well, that's the question, right? Which is for those that are now saying, well, we should have stayed. The question is, how long would be reasonable? Because if 20 years didn't accomplish whatever, 1 year more is unlikely to do it. So then you're already talking about, well, by saying stay, are you saying stay 5 more years? Are you saying another 20? And, there were a couple, I don't remember who they were, but there were a couple of neocons I saw in right-wing media who were actually honest. And they were like, yeah, we should just have a permanent presence there. And it's like, while I disagree completely, at least they're just being upfront. And they're like, I think leaving's bad because we should just stay forever. That's it. And it's like, okay, all right, I can deal with you if you're honest in that sense.
That's only the first part of the puzzle, too. Because then the question isn't just how long are we staying, but also what are we going to change in strategy?
Right.
Because I would not dedicate a soldier to stay another day in a country if our strategy is failing and we don't have another strategy to fix it. Because at that point, what you're doing is you're just clogging holes in a sinking ship, and you're just going with the same old strategy that hasn't worked for the last 20 years. And we have no reason to believe that it's going to work in the next 20. I would also say, on the other hand, and I do want to bring attention to this, that it also has been difficult as somebody who covers these human rights abuses that's going on in Afghanistan and covered them while the withdrawal was happening and talking about what the reality was going to be with the Taliban ruling Afghanistan. To any time I'd bring that up, it felt like somebody would say, I would bring up the Taliban are awful, evil, and bad, and we need to talk about what the reality is going to be for women in Afghanistan. And someone would say, well, it sounds like just pro-war machine propaganda. Where I think that left-wingers generally need to acknowledge the consequences of foreign policy decisions, that we cannot pretend that when we exit a country or when we leave this environment, that everything's going to be peaches and cream and everything's going to be wonderful. We need to acknowledge the pain that's going to be caused to women and minority group like the Hazara population of Afghanistan, and talk about what we should do moving forward to best help them. My strategy is to take in as many refugees as physically possible and then see where we can go from there, right? But it felt like also anytime I bring up any of that, there would also be a weird virtue signaling backlash in the other direction. I hate to play the both sides on that, but it felt weird.
No, there was. It was going on. Now, what do you imagine that? Because remember, Trump announced the same plan to leave Afghanistan. Trump had announced it. Imagine Trump had done it and the same chaos had taken place. What would the Trump PR machine have done? Would they simply have said, hey, you got to blame George W. Bush. He's the guy who got us in, and just left it at that and not explained anything else and just made it that cut and dry?
I think the first thing I do want to say about Trump that's interesting about Afghanistan is he started his administration with a troop increase in Afghanistan, increasing drone strikes, restricting data to that information, and dropping the MOAB. And then by the end of his administration, which he was saying on the campaign trail, bomb the families with terrorists, he's like, well, let me negotiate with some of them.
Yeah.
Yeah, just a complete 180. And it shows that, and I mean this, that a lot of people like to say that Trump's just like an isolationist, or he has this foreign policy. He doesn't have any fundamental foreign policy beliefs, right? He just sticks his finger in the air and goes that way. He was for the war in Iraq. He was for intervening in Libya. He was for going into Afghanistan. He was for all these conflicts. And now that is politically beneficial, he's going the other way. He just sticks his finger in the air. So I just want to like say that he has no fundamental foreign policy
Of course.
beliefs. So I honestly think that he probably would have stayed maybe with the May deadline that he set. I have no reason to believe, and he hasn't indicated that he would have switched that deadline. And I think that he would have handled the situation either as bad or worse, because I don't know if he could have been able to have the logistical skills or be able to point the right people in the right direction to have one of the largest airlifts in human history. Because I will say the Biden administration most certainly dropped the ball on a few things.
Sure.
The leaving of biometric data, his oh my god, the interview after the person fell off the plane to their death, and he's like, oh, that's 4 or 5 days. I mean, that's just terribly callous, right? Now,
Absolutely.
I think maybe a higher level of callousness might have been shown by a different individual. And I don't know if he would have been able to do that airlift or been able to pick up the ball, right? And
Right.
so that's the way I like to classify Biden's withdrawal. Is he's dropped the ball, then he picked it up and did what he could do in the fastest way possible. A Trump withdrawal would have been months earlier in May. He would not have had the logistical skill or the management skills to get this done. And he would have been 10 times more callous. And all those allies that we're talking about we needed to support and bring out, needed to be included in the airlift, they would have been considered less, because he plays to a base of people who don't like to take in refugees. He said on the campaign trail, I want a total and complete shutdown of Muslims entering the United States.
Yeah.
Now, it might surprise people to hear this, but Afghanistan actually has a lot of those
Yeah.
and within the borders of Afghanistan. And you see the right-wing fearmonger regime right now. Biden's bringing in a horde of refugees. Russia Today actually edited AK-47s and RPGs onto the backs
I
of
saw that.
refugees with their children going on.
And wasn't there explanation that it was satire? But like there was nothing that would indicate that it was satire. It was one of the strangest explanations. There was just not. It just looked like a story headline. It was weird.
It's bullshit. Russia Today has a long history of pushing their main goal is to push divisive messaging to the highest extent for divisiveness sake and for clicks. Another
Yeah.
example of this is I remember when Hillary Clinton they had this story that I think has been removed from the YouTube since then, of this person talking about how basically the Jews are controlling a large part of Hillary Clinton's campaign.
Mhm.
And then, hey, look, there's a triangle in one of the symbols of their company. And it was just posted.
Yeah.
on
Oh
their
yeah.
post. It was posted on the YouTube. Eventually it was taken down, but they have a long history of pushing blatantly bigoted messaging. Yeah.
So let's see. I generally speaking agree with you about how Trump would have handled the withdrawal. I think the reaction would have been callous is probably an understatement, but I certainly agree with you about that. I do think that, Trump was able to come up with these. It's not just, they weren't just incoherent, but they were almost like satirical public positions when he would screw stuff up. And I have like a morbid curiosity. What kind of insane thing would Jared Kushner have dreamed up to explain the exact same level of chaos or even more if Trump did actually oversee the withdrawal from Afghanistan? It's I don't actually know what it would be, but particularly on COVID and on hurricanes, like on everything, he was just able to do stuff. Who could imagine?
I am scared that he would have done the withdrawal, then reversed his decision.
Oh,
The
interesting.
reason why is because if we see Syria, now that was a withdrawal that was horribly botched and didn't even need to happen. Because when you look at the withdrawal, he pulled the troops out of northeastern Syria off the border after making the Kurds, the YPJ and the YPG, disarm themselves on the border with a deal with Turkey.
Mhm.
Then he moves them back. They get slaughtered. Politicians get dragged out of cars and shot. I don't need to describe the brutality, but it was terrible. He redeploys them in Iraq, says they're coming home, and then just redeploys them back into Syria.
Right.
Just completely reverses the decision. The only difference was now they were in a worse strategic position, and now thousands more people were dead. That was the only difference. And so my fear is, and that was due to the backlash and people walking into his office and pointing at charts and saying, but there's oil in Syria, Trump. I think that was Mitch McConnell who did that. So my fear is that he would have been going through with this withdrawal, made the deal with the Taliban, gone with this May deadline, been as catastrophic or more catastrophic than midway through after chaos was happening, since he has no fundamental foreign policy beliefs. And Joe Biden for years has talked about in private how he wanted to get out of Afghanistan. There's a lot of these things coming out in I think it was 2011, where he had a conversation with a staffer where someone was trying to convince him, like, maybe we should stay for the feminism. And he's like, dude, that's nonsense. That's nonsensical.
Right.
Trump
I'm curious though.
If the wind pushed him in that direction, he could have reversed his position on Afghanistan like that.
Yeah, I don't disagree. I think though that there is, Trump will sometimes off-ramp things that he promises, but he'll never really just say, I changed my mind because the situation changed. He'll say, well, someone blocked me from doing it, or it's rhinos, or it's Democrats, or whatever. So while I agree with you that on policy, he could have ended up saying, we're not doing it, or we're going back in, but he never would have said, because it got chaotic and I didn't predict that. He would always have figured out some way to either blame other Republicans who got in the way or Democrats or whoever, because it's just, there's no instances where he said, I miscalculated.
He would have put it probably on the Afghans, that the ANA just collapsed so fast because the Afghan people are just so cowardly and so terrible. I think, hey, that's a foreign enemy he can pin it on, right? Yeah. That's the type of thing, the type of dialogue I could see him doing, because you can see that dialogue going on right now. Because there's so many reports of ANA soldiers being tremendously brave, but if you don't have supplies, you don't have ammunition, and you are also starving. There's many reports of them just not getting fed even, and not paid on top of that.
Right.
And you're facing the Taliban, like, yeah, no shit, many of them weren't able to hold out, right? But he could just pin it on the cowardly foreigners not being able to hold up defense, even though we've saved them for 20 years. I could see him running along with that. I mean, that's what they're doing right now. I mean, they're saying, why do all these Afghans need to come to America? Why aren't they at home fighting the Taliban, fighting for their own country if they love these values so much?